Very pleased to welcome Mike Huckabee to the show, author of God, Guns, Grits, and Gravy, a fellow Southerner. Can't wait to hear your take on everything and all that is going on. Mike, welcome to this program.
Thank you, Franklin. Great to be with you.
You ask in your book, have I been taken to a different planet than the one on which I grew up? And this is a feeling that we share with you. So what's going on?
Well, I think that there is a real cultural disconnect between people living in what I call the bubbles of New York, Washington, D.C., and Hollywood. And it doesn't matter whether it's fashion, finance, music, politics, government, television, movies. There's a different way of looking at the world. And again, I realize this is a generalization, but I'm telling you that there is a cultural disconnect between people living in those bubbles and people living in flyover country, or as I call it, the land of God, Guns, Grits, and Gravy. That's where the title comes from. And I'll give you just one example. People in Washington are totally ignorant. I mean, absolutely out of touch with the life that people have to live out in the real world, where their property values have gone down, where their paychecks have become stagnant for 40 years, because Washington always finds itself to be a recession-proof economy. And when politicians go back home and have a town hall meeting and they are stunned and shocked that they're being yelled at in town hall meetings, and they always act like, oh my gosh, what are you people mad about? And that's just one example, and there are dozens and dozens, and I cite many of them in the book, of how this cultural disconnect, I think, is very real, Franklin. And I know that the book's had some, let me just say, reaction that has affirmed the message of it by many of the elites in those three bubbles.
You point to a disconnect, and I wonder if that is not the reason why our representatives, and you know, former governor of Arkansas, great politician, and I know that you're a historian as well. We come back to these founding framer or founding father moments where we think we're so far from where we should be. We've traded so much freedom for so little security, and yet we seem to do it with joy in our hearts. Take our freedoms. I wonder if this disconnect doesn't have something to do with the fact that people don't feel as if their representatives represent them anymore. What happened to that idea that the representative represented his constituents in government and he was like them in some way? I mean, we have polls that say, for instance, on the issue of homosexual marriage, the representatives don't do what the constituents want them to do. And maybe this is the bubble you're talking about. Mike?
Well, it's one of many issues. There are so very many, but let's keep in mind, Washington has become a roach motel. People go in, but they never come out. One of the reasons that I'm such a strong proponent of term limits for members of Congress, and by the way, for the judiciary as well, is because I don't think that public service ought to be a permanent career in which people spend their time doing everything they can to stay in office, to stay in power. They ought to go serve their fellow citizens, do it for a limited period of time, and then go back home and live under the laws that they passed so that they don't lose touch and they don't lose that connection with the people back home. Right now we have a system where when they do get voted out of office, which is rare, but it occasionally happens, or they retire, they stay in Washington and become well-heeled lobbyists and still spend the rest of their time living in that same insular world.
It's really remarkable, considering the fact that, you know, I have a house in Mount Vernon, Virginia, just down the river, and you know, Washingtonians, we love history. You know, we love it. We seem to be so in touch with who we are as Americans, and yet we don't act it. This term limit business is extraordinary. Who could possibly be against term limits? Maybe you can explain that. Who and why? What? We never wanted career politicians. Our own president, George Washington, was very clear on this, as was Jefferson, on all sides of the Federalist aisle. And yet, we've just come so far. I guess we can't see, we can't look behind us and see where we should be, so we don't know where we are.
Well, the founders talked about putting term limits in the Constitution and decided that it wasn't necessary because they said nobody's going to want to make this a career. And Washington, of course, stepped down and he said, I'm going to serve 2 terms. I'm going back home and be a farmer. So it was the culture of the early days in which Jefferson thought about putting it in there. There was a push by James Madison and several of the founders to say, yeah, let's go ahead and just codify that. But they thought, no, this is never going to be a problem. They would be appalled if they saw what is happening today. That's one of the reasons that we need to go ahead now and codify it. Part of the reason that I think term limits, and there's so many things that we should do, but here's part of the problem. When we created the 17th Amendment, and a lot of people, I'm stunned how many people don't even realize that this was a significant shift in government. But when we started electing senators by popular vote, instead of having them appointed by their state legislature, it means that the senators no longer give a hoot what happens in their states. They're not responsible or accountable to the impact on the states, and i.e. the 10th Amendment. And now they behave with reckless disregard to the whole idea of federalism. They push power toward the centralized federal government because that's where they are, and they want more power for themselves. In the way it was intended to be, the states had the power, and the federal government was supposed to be essentially a rather weak government, strong only in border security, making sure we had a military that could protect us. But it didn't do a whole lot else, and it wasn't ever supposed to.
You remind me of something I haven't thought of in some time. I have a small company called Raff Radio, and we did some work for Heritage. And I was waiting and just visiting with some of the interns at the Heritage Foundation and looking at my calendar, and all these wide-eyed, bright, young so-called conservatives were talking back and forth. And I said, it's the anniversary of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. And I sort of got all these glazed looks, and then I lightly cussed, which one does not do at Heritage, but I cussed lightly, and I said, and the federal government has been out of such and such control ever since. I got some smiles. You're a Southerner. In your book, God, Guns, Grits, and Gravy, how do you sort of weave in motifs of freedom and liberty and, I guess, flavors of life, Mike Huckabee, that are distinctly Southern?
Well, one of the chapters deals with how we have surrendered so much of our personal liberties. When we go to get on an airplane and we walk into a electronic strip search, we hold our hands up in the surrender position, and we allow ourselves to be potentially humiliated by having someone take a look at us from top to bottom, go through our luggage, inspect everything, ask us questions without probable cause, all to be able to travel. We just sort of take that in stride. Now, it's a chapter I call Bend Over and Take It Like a Prisoner. A lot of people thought I was talking of prison rape, and they clearly didn't read the book. They only read the title of the chapter, but I'm convinced a lot of liberals can't read more than about 8 words per day, and therefore it was impossible for them to see it. My point was, when a prisoner goes into the prison system, and as a governor, I ran all the prisons, so I understand it. I've been to the prisons. I've seen the intake process. And the first thing that a person does when they go as a new inmate is they have a full body cavity search to make sure they're not bringing any contraband. And today, just to get on an airplane, you're not an inmate. You haven't been convicted. You haven't been sentenced. But we virtually put people through an inmate intake process with total strangers, putting their hands all over private parts of our body, and we're supposed to just stand there, and that's why I say bend over and take it like a prisoner.
It's rather like the frog in the pot of water. I'm sure you're familiar with the analogy, Mike Huckabee. We have surrendered our freedoms so gradually. You know, I wrote a piece in 2010 that was called A Memo from the Department of Horses. And it at the turn of the century, of course, and in 2010 also, the horse was still our primary mode of transportation in this country, believe it or not. The automobile wasn't really popular like it is now until really the 30s. But if we apply the laws that apply to our roads and cars to horses, the comparison is completely ridiculous. All the taxes, this notion, for instance, that our car is ours. Your car isn't yours, Governor. You know very well that with all these stickers and laws and tailpipe sniffing devices, the notion, for instance, that you mentioned of an arrest, we're arrested all the time without warrants. We have safety stops now in which law enforcement officers, sometimes disguised as not law enforcement officers, stop citizens for no reason. It seems to me we fought a war over this, didn't we? I mean, wasn't this precisely what the Revolutionary War was about? And we've forgotten.
Well, we're living in a time where we lost any semblance of our history. And what disturbs me is we don't even know how the Constitution works. We today have the doctrine of judicial supremacy, which reigns supreme in America, and it so violates the spirit of the Constitution, in which you have three completely equal branches of government. But you have an executive branch right now who says, I've got a pen and a phone. You have a judicial branch that essentially believes that they can create law by issuing an opinion. Yeah. And the one branch of government that has the power to stop it, the congressional legislative branch, who could turn the power of the purse into the spigot and turn it off, doesn't have the guts and courage to stand up and say, wait a minute, we've all sworn to uphold a document called the Constitution. You guys are violating it, and we're not going to let you get away with it.
Yes, somehow the case history has made it so that the judicial branch is creating law. They have become the lawmakers, and we see this in our so-called living, breathing document. I don't know how we come back from where we are, but I'm interested to know, Mike Huckabee, where to start, other than buying your book, of course, God, Guns, Grits, and Gravy.
That's a great start.
Where do we start? Yeah.
I think the first thing we truly do is that we put limits on the time that people serve. We also start devolving power back to the states. This is where it should have been. The best government is the most local government because it's closest to the people being governed. A lot of things that we do at the federal level have no basis in the Constitution, whether it's education decisions, many of the environmental laws that we enforce. They're not constitutional. They should be determined at the local level. You have people who have never been on a farm in their life, who are sitting in a concrete building in Washington, who are telling a farmer whose livelihood depends on him taking good care of the land, and they're telling him that a mud puddle is a protected wetland and making it very difficult for him to earn a living as a farmer. Now, that decision needs to be made by somebody much closer to the farm than somebody who read a book one time called Old MacDonald Had a Farm, E-I-E-I-O, and has no real experience in what it means to grow crops.
I know the building you're talking about. The people you're talking about, too. Some of those guys are my old friends. It is remarkable, the disconnect. And by the way, the language for this wetland business is stunning. It's written so loosely that it allows the federal government to prosecute cases if it rains on somebody's backyard. It becomes a waterway all of a sudden. There's no limitations to the language, and it's almost as if the bullies have taken over the schoolyard, and they're nowhere near the schoolyard. People are angry. I'd be very interested to know if you feel that the current Republican control will be good for our country, or whether we're just in another sort of wimpy phase of Republicans in name only. In fact, one wonders what it means to be a Republican anymore. What do you say, Mike Huckabee?
Franklin, it only is going to matter if we get strong leadership that is principled and that will try bold things. If we get a president, and I have some thoughts about that, but if we were to get a president who had bold ideas that would like to really challenge the status quo, maybe some things could change. But if all we do is get people who want to make sure that they remain popular, get invited to the nice cocktail parties, we're in real trouble. Let me just add another very important thing. When we ask what can we do, I'm a strong proponent of the fair tax, and I know our time's gone, but I just hope people will learn about it, because it not only would transform the economy, but frankly, it would get rid of the IRS, which has become a criminal enterprise in the U.S.
It's a political tool now, isn't it? It's a tool for political persuasion. Thank you so much. All right, that's great. Mike, I'm glad you said it, because this is something we can do. Take a good look at the fair tax. Let's examine it. Let's support it. I'm very grateful for all the work you do politically and also as an entertainer. You're great, Mike, and this is a great book. God, Guns, Grits, and Gravy by Mike Huckabee. This is 1590 WCGO, Chicago's New Talk. I'm Franklin Raff. Back in a moment.